And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
America is in shock. The Canadian province of Ontario is taking a step that could change the entire financial landscape of North America. For the first time in more than a decade, Ontario has issued bonds in dollars. But here's what's shocking. This time, American banks have stayed away. Instead, the largest Canadian and British players are stepping in. What does this mean for the market and for Canada itself? Let's take a closer look.
Tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
The fact that Ontario has decided to exclude American banks from such an important deal is not just an economic move. It is a signal that Canada is ready to protect its economic interests. It's no secret that relations between the US and Canada have not been at their best lately, with trade tariffs, threats, and mutual accusations. But this move is no longer just a political squabble. It's a question of how much the trade and financial relations between the two countries could change in the future.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
And so, instead of trusting the usual players in the market, such as JP Morgan or Bank of America, Ontario has decided to put its trust in other banks. Barclays, Canadian giants BMO, CIBC, and Scotiabank have become the main players in this deal. This choice is no accident, and there is much more to it than just a desire to save money on intermediaries. It is a blow to American financial power, which Trump, of course, could not ignore.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
Trump, not hiding his indignation, has already stated that this is not just a mistake, but a clear act of aggression on the part of Canada. After all, these bonds could have been sold by American banks, but instead they ended up outside the US. This was a shockwave for the American financial system. However, despite the president's indignation, Canadian banks do not yet feel vulnerable. They have proven that they can handle the task, and the result has been very successful for Ontario. The bond market was looking for new solutions, and this move sent a strong signal.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
What will happen next? It is unlikely that the US will remain indifferent. With this move, the Canadian province has demonstrated not only its independence but also its readiness for new economic strategies. How will this affect the entire North American economy? How will relations between countries change in a changing world order? We seek answers to these questions in this video. Stay with us to find out why Canada and the US are on the brink of a new financial conflict and what lies ahead for global financial markets in the near future.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
In early May 2025, Canada and the US found themselves at the center of another financial crisis that could shift the balance of power in global markets. Ontario, one of Canada's largest provinces, decided to issue bonds in US dollars. At first glance, this appears to be a routine financial transaction. However, there was an unexpected twist. For the first time since 2011, the Canadian province did not include US banks in the process, completely ignoring financial titans such as JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs. Instead, the deal was conducted solely by Canadian banks and international financial giants such as Barclays. This move caused a storm in financial circles and had serious consequences for relations between the two countries, which are traditionally considered strong economic partners. For many economists and politicians, this came as a complete surprise. Since the onset of the global financial crisis in 2008, the US has always been a major player in the Canadian financial market, providing its infrastructure and support for such large transactions. However, this year, Ontario decided to take a different approach. Official sources claim that the rejection of American banks was caused not only by the political situation, but also by internal economic considerations. According to information obtained from analytical agencies, Ontario has faced several setbacks in its partnership with American financial institutions. Sometimes deals were delayed, and the terms were excessive. In response, the Premier of Ontario, as well as several economists, began to argue that it was time to look for alternative ways. To this end, the British Barclays and Canadian banks were chosen, which incidentally offered more favorable terms and quickly secured capital.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
It was a bold move, and many saw it as more than just a commercial deal, but a direct challenge to the U.S. Although Ontario government officials insisted that it was purely based on economic considerations, the political subtext was obvious. In recent years, relations between Canada and the US have not been cloudless. This primarily concerned the policies of President Trump, who has repeatedly criticized Canada over tariffs, trade agreements, and even the environment. In response to pressure from the US, some Canadian officials began discussing the need to strengthen the the country's independence from the US and its financial system. It was precisely these sentiments that apparently played a role in the decision to issue bonds without the participation of American banks.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
In addition, experts began to raise another issue that could not but affect this decision. Despite its power in the financial sector, the U.S. has faced some problems in its banking system. First, the corporate structure of American financial giants is too complex, which leads to overload and slows down the decision-making process. Second, a large number of American banks have been involved in several major scandals involving corruption and financial data manipulation. Against this backdrop, Canadian and British banks began to look more attractive for large financial transactions, especially when it was necessary to act quickly and efficiently.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
The global reaction to Ontario's decision also drew attention to this event. It was expected that serious measures would be taken in the US to maintain control over the Canadian financial market. And of course, there was a sir-hot reaction from President Trump himself. Just a few days after the deal was concluded, he expressed his dissatisfaction with the Canadian authorities, claiming that they had tried to create competition for the US in the financial market. He did not mince his words, accusing Canada of economic aggression. Why are they doing this? We have always supported Canada, and now they decide to work without us, Trump said at a press conference. In response, the Canadian authorities claimed that they were acting solely in their own interests and that the US was not the only player in the financial market. What happened as a result? Ontario's deal attracted significant investor attention. Despite the political turmoil and negative reaction from the US, the bonds were quickly sold, demonstrating interest in the Canadian market. Moreover, the bonds were purchased not only by Canadian financial institutions, but also by international investors, confirming the growing interest in the country's economy. It seems that the decision to abandon US intermediaries was justified. However, no one can say for sure how other countries will react and how the financial landscape in North America will change in the long term.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
But despite the commercial success, this event also revealed some weaknesses in the US financial system. The US remains a leading player in global financial markets, but steps such as Ontario's rejection of US intermediaries may be a harbinger of more serious changes in the future. Economists predict that in the coming years, similar cases may become the norm for other countries, leading to a change in the order of global financial markets. This may start with other Canadian provinces that decide to follow Ontario's example. Thus, this step was not just an economic decision. It became part of a broader trend in international politics and economics. It was not just a rejection of American banks, but also a clear statement that Canada is ready to seek ways to strengthen its independence in the economic sphere. The reaction to Ontario's decision to issue bonds without the participation of American banks was not long in coming. Just a few days after this move, a real storm broke out in the US. President Trump publicly expressed his outrage, noting that such actions by Canada could be seen as economic aggression. He called on his supporters to protest against Canada's financial approach, arguing that it was a move that threatened the future of US financial institutions. His words had a significant impact on public opinion in the US, and many began to see this move as the first sign of possible financial discord between the two countries. Trump noted that the US had always supported Canada despite disagreements on some issues, and that the refusal of American banks to participate in such an important deal was a gesture directed not only against US financial interests, but also against the very idea of free trade and economic cooperation. According to him, if such actions remain unanswered, this could lead to a further weakening of US influence in global financial markets. He also stressed that Ontario's decision could have long-term consequences for the entire US financial sector, which now risks losing even such stable and profitable deals as the issuance of Canadian bonds. Against this backdrop, the Canadian authorities tried to justify their move solely on economic grounds. The Ontario Premier said that the decision to issue bonds without the participation of US intermediaries was made primarily due to the need to optimize financial conditions and more favorable offers from Canadian and British banks. In response to Trump's criticism, Canadian officials emphasized that, despite the absence of US banks, the deal was successful and investor interest was so high that the bonds were sold out in record time. Moreover, in their opinion, the refusal to use American intermediaries was an important step towards strengthening Canada's financial independence. However, in response to harsh criticism from the US, more subtle hints began to emerge that the decision to issue bonds was part of a more complex political game. Some experts suggested that Ontario's actions were a veiled protest against Trump's policies, especially given his aggressive stance on tariffs and international trade. In particular, Political analysts pointed out that pressure from right-wing forces in Canada could have created an atmosphere in which rejecting American banks would become a symbol of economic and political independence. It is noteworthy that while the US was actively pursuing an America for Americans policy, Canada was increasingly distancing itself from its southern neighbor in an attempt to strengthen its position in global markets. These underlying factors were not so obvious to the general public, but they clearly existed and influenced the course of events. Despite all these reactions, the consequences for the deal itself were far less dramatic than many analysts had predicted. Canada not only successfully placed the bonds, but also received positive reviews from the world's largest investors. The deal went through with minimal risk, and demand for Canadian bonds was much higher than expected. This success showed that the financial market can function successfully even without the participation of traditional American players. It is noteworthy that the main buyers of the bonds were not only Canadian banks but also investors from Europe, which reinforced the view that Canada is playing an increasingly important role in global financial markets. Nevertheless, Trump continued his criticism, stating that America should not tolerate such behavior from its northern neighbor. In one of his press conferences, he said that if this trend continues, he will be forced to take more decisive measures against Canada, including the introduction of new tariffs on Canadian goods and services. Trump's challenge could lead to an even more serious escalation of the trade war. But it also made the global community think about the possibility of a new financial split between the world's two largest economies. Meanwhile, financial experts began to discuss the broader context of this event. The issuance of Canadian bonds without the participation of US banks could be the first step towards significant changes in the global financial system. In the long term, this decision could weaken the US's influence on the global market, especially if other countries, such as the UK or EU countries, follow Canada's example and start using their own financial instruments to attract investment. In addition, in recent years, there has been a growing number of countries seeking to reduce their dependence on the US dollar, which also affects financial relations between Canada and the US. Either way, Ontario's decision has not been without consequences. It attracted the attention of the global media, sparking a lot of discussion and debate among politicians and economists alike. Regardless of how the situation develops in the future, one thing is clear: this step has sent an important signal to all parties, showing that the world is not standing still and that financial and trade relations between countries can change, sometimes in unexpected and radical ways. After Ontario successfully placed its bonds without the participation of US banks, the reaction to this move continued to develop. Many experts began to raise questions about the deeper significance of this event for the global financial system. At first glance, it would seem to be just one deal, but its consequences could be much more serious. In addition to the diplomatic and political consequences that have already begun to emerge, this deal could mark the beginning of a new trend, with countries seeking ways to reduce their dependence on the US in financial matters. Canada, which has traditionally been closely linked to the US economically, is now showing a desire for greater independence. If such a move had been taken a few years ago, it might have been too risky, but in the context of global economic change, given the growing dissatisfaction with the US and its policies, this move appears to be a more than reasonable decision. Investors, especially from Europe and Asia, have begun to view Canada as a safer and more independent market for their investments. The process of accelerating globalization and economic growth in developing countries is also influencing global financial flows. In this context, the Canadian economy is beginning to show signs of strength, which in turn reduces its dependence on the US. Canadian financial authorities will undoubtedly take advantage of this opportunity to further promote their interests on the world stage. And if other countries follow Ontario's example, the US's refusal to participate in such large deals will become part of a new economic order. In recent years, there has been a growing trend among many countries to reduce their dependence on the US dollar. This is a process that could lead to the creation of alternative global financial structures in the future. The Canadian authorities could use this opportunity to promote their bonds as an alternative to the dollar, which would further diversify global currency reserves. Meanwhile, the US is beginning to realize that its financial system may not be as stable as it seemed. Despite its power in the global market, America is facing growing problems in its financial system. In recent years, American banks have been involved in several major scandals related to manipulation and fraud. This fact makes the US vulnerable in the eyes of global investors. who are beginning to look for safer markets in which to invest. One such market is Canada, which, in its policy of financial independence from the US, is betting on more transparent and stable conditions for investors. However, Ontario's move is only the beginning. Despite the success of this particular bond issue, the Canadian economy and its financial institutions will continue to face challenges. If Trump decides that the Canadian market poses a threat to the US economy, he may take further steps to put pressure on Canada. Economists warn that the US could respond by increasing tariffs on Canadian goods or imposing new economic sanctions, which would significantly complicate economic relations between the two countries. However, by this point, the world is already becoming more multipolar in financial terms. Traditional players in the financial markets are beginning to lose their monopoly, and new financial hubs are emerging in different parts of the world. Some countries, such as the UK and Germany, have already begun to seek closer economic cooperation with Canada, which could lead to new financial blocs that would reduce the role of the US in the global economy. Many analysts believe that this situation will create conditions for the emergence of alternative financial institutions, where countries with economies less prone to political crises, such as Canada and the European Union, will play a leading role.